안녕하세요. 정책학 방법론 두 번째 세션입니다. 이번에는 이제 질적 연구에 관한 거고요. 오늘도 제가 그 질적 연구 관련해서 진지하게 연구하고 있는 신진학자 한 분을 모셨습니다. 고려대학교 필리시아 이스타드 교수님이시고요. 오늘은 질적 방법론의 현재와 미래에 대해서 좀 더 같이 살펴보는 그런 기회를 가지려고 합니다. 필리시아 교수님이 이제 대부분의 강의를 영강으로 진행하시긴 할 텐데 국어도 되게 잘하세요. 그래서 국어로도 한 번씩 정리를 해주실 것 같아요. 그리고 질문도 국어로 하셔도 됩니다. 그래서 편안한 분위기에서 하시고 싶은 질문 많이 하시고 토론하시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 그럼 필리시아 교수님을 시켜드리겠습니다.
Hello, I'm excited to present today on research methodologies and specifically qualitative methodology. So I will speak in English and I will mix up with a bit of Korean. My Korean is not perfect, so I hope you forgive me, but I will try my best. And if you have questions, like Professor Chung said, you can ask them in Korean or in English, and I will do my best to answer. So to tell a bit about my background, I do both qualitative and quantitative research. And I've also done mixed methodology research. And so I thought it would be helpful today to talk a bit about these different perspectives of research and how qualitative research fits into the larger field of research methodologies. For that reason, I'm going to start today's lecture by talking about research methodologies. And that is because it is useful to understand why we do qualitative research and with what assumptions we do qualitative research. Because the assumptions that build on qualitative research are different from those of quantitative research. That being said, however, I want to convince you today that qualitative and quantitative research is not that different. They share a lot of commonalities. And I think sometimes we forget those commonalities when we do qualitative research. And so I also want to spend this lecture focusing on how to publish, how to successfully publish qualitative research, because that is one of the greatest challenges of doing qualitative research. So we'll start by talking about what qualitative research is, why we do it, and then we're going to move on to talking about how to do it. So there is this book by Moses and Knudsen. I strongly recommend it. It's called Ways of Knowing. And regardless of whether you're interested in qualitative or quantitative research methodologies, what this book talks about in depth is the different ways that we achieve knowledge and the different ways that we assume and build knowledge. And this is particularly useful when we want to understand the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. So the lecture that we just saw on research experiments, it assumes deduction and a priori knowledge. It is largely within the quantitative methodology. And what this field of methodology assumes is that there are ways of logically deducting reasons and relations. And through these logically deducted relations, we can make a set of theses. And building on those theories, we can create a set of hypotheses that we test. And so the idea is that there is a priori knowledge that is out there and which we can use to test with new data the assumptions that exist. But induction assumes the opposite. Induction critiques the deductive assumption of a priori knowledge. It says that there is no such thing as existing knowledge. We can only gain knowledge by going out there and observing. So only from data can we gain knowledge. And this distinction is important, but I think sometimes it's a bit exaggerated when it comes to qualitative research. Because the point here is not that we assume no prior knowledge in qualitative research. The point is that we always seek to learn more from the field, to gain more observations from the field. And so there is a distinction between quantitative and qualitative research about the way we understand the relationship between theory and observations. So I talked about deduction, induction, priori, a priori knowledge. Those are fancy words. They're difficult to comprehend. But when we think about the relationship between theory and observation, it's more easy to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative research. So in quantitative research, we start with a theory. There is an existing theory that we can adapt to our research project. And then we can use a set of data. Maybe we collect data, maybe we use existing data, and then we test that theory. In qualitative research, the traditional assumption is that we start with observations. We go out into the field, we collect observations, and then based on those observations, we develop a set of theories. This is the traditional way of thinking about theory and observations. But I want to emphasize over and over in this lecture that it's very hard to publish qualitative research that starts with observations. Every research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, it starts by acknowledging that there is theory out there, that there are theories built by other scholars. And then, even if you do qualitative research, you refine and you build on those theories. But it's very rare in social science research to build entirely new theories based on observations. Yeah.
전 슬라이드를 한번 보여주실래요? Previous slide. Previous slide. 그 전에 슬라이드. 전에 거. 네. 예, 여기서 얘기하듯. 이게 뭐 어떻게 보면은 그 철학적인 접근 중에 이성주의와 경험주의하고 관련돼 있잖아요. 그러니까 뭐냐면 이성주의는 우리가 생각하는 진리가 있고 그거에서 파생해서 사고를 할 수 있는 거. 또 경험주의는 우리가 경험하는 것들로부터 우리가 뭔가를 새로운 생각을 만들 수 있다는 그런 건데 이게 지금 아까 얘기한 것처럼 그런 것들을 이제 구분할 수 있는데 아까 퀄리테이티브하고 퀀티테이티브를 얘기하면서 퀀티테이티브는 티어리에 기반해서 테스팅을 주로 하는 거고 근데 퀄리테이티브는 어떤 경험을 통해서 티어리를 새로 만드는 거고 근데 이제 대개는 리터러처에선 이게 혼합이 돼 있는 것 같아요. Mixed together. 그래서 어떤 식으로 주로 이해되고 있냐면 내가 티어리를 퀀티테이티브하게 테스트할 수 있는 게 있고 그 외에 퀀티테이티브하게 확인됐는데 실제로 이게 어떤 일이 일어나고 있는지를 퀄리테이티브하게 확인한다라고 주로 생각을 하지 퀄리테이티브에서 새로운 티어리를 만든다고 생각을 안 하는 것 같아요. 그러다 거기에서 이제 그런 컨퓨전이 생기는 것 같아요. 어떤가요?
질문 다시.
So typically you explain that quantitative research, we are testing the hypothesis based on the theory. Qualitative research is like we collect the information, the interviews, and then in-depth observation, and then based on it we make a theory, right? But in reality, when you do the research in the literature, we typically doing quantitative research to test the hypothesis, but then maybe that's not enough because we don't know what kind of story is going on. So qualitative study, qualitative research is supporting the quantitative research. We are thinking about that way, right? But then your point is that the actual essence of qualitative research is try to build up the new theory. Am I right?
So the traditional assumption about qualitative research is that it seeks to build new theory. But what I want to show you today is that this is a very narrow set of qualitative research called grounded theory. It's one way of doing qualitative theory. But most qualitative research is focused on refining, improving, enhancing existing theory. So there is not really, in most published social science qualitative research, a strong distinction between what we call deduction and induction. So traditionally, when we learn about these research methodologies in graduate school, we learn that they have entirely different ways of looking at the world. But what I want to show you is that there is actually something called abduction. And I didn't list it on the slide because it's a bit on the side. But the point of abduction is that you always engage with both induction and deduction at the same time. And what I want to emphasize is that also in quantitative research, typically the structure that we follow is that we collect data. So we start with a theory, 이론, and then we collect the data and we analyze the data. So that's the 분석. What are the findings? What does our analysis show? But then we have this next part in most quantitative research called 해석. And in this part, we are discussing not just the policy implications of our research, but the theoretical implications of our findings. Because typically, or oftentimes, you will have quantitative research findings that are in part supportive of the theory or entirely supportive of the theory. And depending on what you find, that will have implications for theory building. You're either supporting the theory or you are refining the theory. And this happens both in qualitative and in quantitative research. But there tends to be, because of grounded theory, there tends to be this superficial distinction where we think that qualitative research is about building theory from nothing, which is most times not the case. And then quantitative research, there's a common conception that we are simply testing theory. That is also not the case. We are testing theory and then we are building that theory to our findings. And so whether we write a qualitative research paper or a quantitative research paper, it is incredibly important that we start with a theory and that we finish with theoretical implications from our findings. So we are continuously speaking to the theoretical literature. And I wanted to convince you that this is not so different for the two lines of research, so the two different methodologies. But there is a difference. There is a very big difference, and that is in quantitative research, when we use the data to test the hypothesis or thesis, we want to test an assumption. So that's the theory, that's the assumption, and we want to test it. But with qualitative research, the reason why we want to go out in the field, collect data, and think about that theory is because we want to challenge assumptions. We don't want to take the outer world there for granted. So we argue in qualitative research that there is no one worldview, there is no objective world. There are different ways of looking at the world out there, and there are different ways of understanding it. And so with that comes the challenging of the assumptions, and some of that research results in theoretical implication that we can use in quantitative research. So quantitative and qualitative research very much speak to each other. You can also start your qualitative research project by looking at quantitative research and to see what kind of theory testing, what kind of theory building and refinement has been done. So these are not polar opposites. They are in conversation, and they should be in conversation. So where does this binary perception come from? In part, there is a perception that qualitative research is necessarily subjective, and that because quantitative research starts with a theory and tests that theory with a representative set of data, it must be objective. But although we don't use the word subjective and objective when we learn about quantitative research, we actually do learn the importance of subjectivity in quantitative research as well, because we're taught to think carefully about how to operationalize our variables. So I want to test this thesis. I set up a hypothesis, and then I collect a set of variables. But how I define those variables, that's important for my research project and the findings that I collect. And so what do I mean by student? Do I mean someone who is currently enrolled in a university? Or do I mean someone who is studying for an exam by themselves? What do we mean by student? When we operationalize our variables, we think about that, and we make subjective decisions. In qualitative research, we think more extensively about this question. What do we mean by students? Is student something that you are objectively qualified as by being someone who study, or is it something that you identify as? I might study but not identify as a student. And so we all think subjectively about these different variables that goes into research, but we do it in different ways. And we do it to different extents. So in a quantitative research project, to the extent that we do that is in operationalization, in our research methodology section. In a qualitative paper, the question of what is a student is part not only of our data collection and our analysis, is also a critical part of our findings. And so the difference then between quantitative and qualitative research is that we center these questions of what do we mean by, or what does this mean to others. And so we assume that there is no one perspective. We assume that there are multiple perspectives, multiple ways of understanding, and that how you understand, for example, a student depends on your position. It depends on the context. It might mean something in one country, and it might mean something different in a different country. And so the purpose of qualitative research is to bring awareness, to take the time, to be sensitive to these differences. And first and foremost, to document that these differences do exist. But be wary, we don't simply want to document. We want to document that differences exist, and then we want to discuss their implication. If I understand students differently from you, then what does that mean for our study of students? So now that we have agreed on the similarities and the commonalities between quantitative and qualitative research, it becomes more obvious that this is not a strict binary. You can do qualitative research that quantifies observations, and you can do quantitative research that qualitatively seek to understand a phenomena or a social group. So, for example, if you have quantitative research that is merely descriptive, I would say that's more of a qualitative approach to a large scale of data. And so I think it's useful to think of research methodologies on a continuum. And in the middle of this continuum, or on each side of the continuum, you have mixed methodologies. A mixed methodology is when we collect both quantitative and qualitative data, or we apply quantitative and qualitative analysis to a set of data. And so we're going to get back to what analysis and data collection means in terms of qualitative research, but it is important to keep in mind that mixed method is not one thing. It's basically a variation of combinations of using different types of data together, and also to using one data set and interpret that to different analytical frameworks. And I want to give a point of warning, and that is about descriptive studies. Because in this binary, or in this continuum, I think we tend to think of qualitative research as more descriptive, and then of quantitative research as more analytical. But as I'm sure that many of you know, if you try to publish a quantitative paper that is purely descriptive, it's going to be difficult to publish. And the same goes for qualitative research. You cannot go out there in the field, collect a lot of data, let's say observations, interview data, come back and write up what you saw with no implications. Neither quantitative nor qualitative research is purely descriptive. And that relates back to the theory building we talked about previously. Because the whole point of doing this research is to build on theory and through theory to understand our social world and by implication also the best possible policies that we can achieve. Okay, one last myth, one last common assumption about the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. I'm doing this comparison because I assume that many of you have quantitative training, but maybe some of you or not all of you have qualitative training. And so there is a preconception that quantitative research, you can test the theory and then you can generalize those findings to a limited set of population or to the general population. We talked about that in the previous lecture. And there's a conception that in qualitative research, because you're so focused on a small population, that it must be case specific, that we're not talking to the general case, but that we're talking about this specific case, and that the implications are limited to that specific case. It is really difficult to publish a case study, especially in social sciences and public policies in the social sciences. So keep in mind that the end goal of a social sciences paper using qualitative methodology is to derive at some type of generalizable knowledge, something that can be applied to other cases, other contexts, and other data. The case is never the focus of a qualitative study, not in social sciences. In anthropology, yes. Anthropology is in humanities. It's a very different type of study. And you can go into a field, you can live in a community for years, and you can write a book about that community. And that in and of itself is valuable. I think it's valuable. But it is difficult to apply that type of approach in social sciences. Because we want to generate some type of generalizable knowledge, something that can be replicated, something that can be built on and redefined by our colleagues. And so for that reason, similar to quantitative research, qualitative researchers are very much concerned about rigor. What is the validity of the data that you have collected? What is the rigor of your research process? And what that means is that you need to collect data that is relevant to your research question. You need to derive knowledge that is replicable or assumptions that are replicable across other contexts and other cases. And so in order to do that, you need to provide great detail in your analysis. It is not sufficient to be descriptive. And here comes another distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. There is something that makes qualitative research very distinct in the field of research generally, and that is the emphasis on what we call reflexivity and positionality. So what that means is who I am as a researcher is going to define my research outcome. And that relates not just to the decisions that we make as researchers, but to some of the extent to which we engage with the research subject. So as you might know, it's common in qualitative research to do interviews, to do ethnography, to go and observe the field, or to talk with people. Those are relational practices. It means I engage with someone directly. So with survey research, we write up a set of questions, we send them out. Sometimes we conduct them in person, but a lot of time there is no connection between the surveyor and the person who is surveyed. But in almost all qualitative research, the person who is researching is present in front of the research subject. So let's say that you are researching, teaching, lecturing, and you sit in this room and you observe me. And if I know that you sit in this room and observe me, that might affect how I perform. And so I need to be aware of the impact that my presence has on my research subject. So that was an abstract example. Let me take a more specific example. Let's say that I'm a highly educated person and I go to make research observation, field site observations in a low education occupation. So let's say that I go to a factory where you have many manual workers, and I stand there and I observe the manual workers. And they are fully aware of my high level of education. And that might create some kind of dynamic. It might create different responses in their interviews. It might create different behaviors during work. And second to that, there's also a concern with power and inequality in qualitative research that we are very attuned to. And part of the title of today's presentation is the future of qualitative research. And I would say that if there has been a shift in qualitative research over the past 5 years, is that reflexivity and positionality has become incredibly important. So if you want to write an excellent piece on qualitative research data, doing analysis, it's important that you reflect in your analysis your position vis-a-vis the research subject, and also reflect on. So reflexivity is a fancy word, but crucially, you need to reflect on how do I impact my research subject. Okay. So there are...
May I ask a quick question? So in the beginning, you mentioned that the big difference between quantitative and qualitative research is that quantitative case is a test, hypothesis, or assumptions, but qualitative typically the challenge the assumptions and hypothesis. What can be the difference between two? Challenge and test. Is that actually same thing? Because that when you do the quantitative research, also we sometimes reject the hypothesis or don't reject the hypothesis, or sometimes out of that research we can develop the new theory and new hypothesis too. But then that's not challenge the hypothesis or assumptions. In what perspective is can be challenge the hypothesis or assumptions? In the case of qualitative, you mentioned that in a qualitative, you challenge the assumptions or hypothesis. Am I right?
Oh yeah, that's actually a really good question. So yeah, I think that's a bit of terminology, because in quantitative research, when we say that we challenge a theory, typically we reject it or we find that it does not support the theory. But in qualitative research, when we say that we challenge the theory, typically we are not challenging the whole assumption, no, the whole relation between X and Y and so forth, the mechanism. But what we are challenging are assumptions underpinning that mechanism. So, for example, if we have a theory that continues to fail to predict the impact of X on Y, typically what you do in qualitative research is that you enter into the field and you try to observe the mechanism between X and Y. And you try to demonstrate that the mechanism, the assumed mechanism, is not in place. And so although it's logically assumed that there is a relationship between X and Y, that X impacts Y, when we enter into qualitative research, we start by challenging those assumptions.
So typically we discuss that the qualitative research is more like to try to figure out the black box of causality, X affects Y, and then what's going on in the middle, that quantitative research, then qualitative research actually giving the implication of what's going on, or sometimes maybe that different conditions or assumptions that we are thinking about the previous causality theory, right? A causal relationship. But that's why that you mentioned about challenge assumptions. Am I right, or is a different perspective?
So my understanding is that in quantitative research, you either want to support or falsify a theory. But that's not the end goal of qualitative research. You want to adjust the theory. And so typically within the theory, you have multiple assumptions. The assumption that the increase in X will result in a decrease in Y, for example. Or that under the conditions of ABC, X will impact Y in this and that way. But in qualitative research, you are looking at the assumption of under what conditions. And you're saying that maybe X impacts Y, but X impacts Y only under the condition of CYX. So typically what it does is complicate theory, or you can change the X. So you're not entirely rejecting the theory that is out there. That is rarely the purpose of qualitative research. But you want to contextualize it. So for example, you might say that X impacts Y in context A, but not in context B. And so that is the contribution of qualitative research.
So yeah, this contextualization part is more like try to figure out what's the inside of the black box that in a causal relationship, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay. So there are different ways to define what is actually qualitative research, and it depends on what you emphasize. So me and Professor Chung, we talked a bit about like the different ways in which you can approach methodology. You can emphasize the type of data that you use, the type of analysis that you use. And so how you define qualitative research is open to interpretation. It might emphasize data collection, and it might emphasize analytical framework. But largely speaking, when we talk about qualitative research in social science, we are looking at social phenomena. We want to understand the causal mechanism that where, for example, X drives a change in Y. And we want to understand why exactly is it that X drives a change in Y. And I emphasize social phenomena because typically what we're looking at is, let's say, under what conditions do students learn from their teacher? Under what conditions are people perceptible to change their opinion? Under what conditions are people more likely to vote? But if you look at social groups, then you want to go into the Amazon and you study this community and you live with them for years. That is not very common in the social sciences. It is very popular in the anthropology, but largely in social science, we want to focus on the social phenomena. And so one key attribute to good publishable qualitative research is that it is systematic and is structured, both in terms of the data that is collected and the analysis that you use to perform. And it starts with theory and it ends with theory, and it results in some type of theory implication. And I want to emphasize again, that does not mean a brand new theory. It means the improvement of theory or changes to a theory and so forth. And again, a typical defining attribute of qualitative research is to emphasize the researcher's position. And that is an integral part of the writing the research as well. And so you need to be reflective on who you are vis-a-vis the research subject during data collection, during data analysis, and also during writing up the research. And so, like we just talked about, there is this emphasis on context. So let's say that we're looking at a policy. What is the context of that policy? It might be a social context, it might be a national context, but we want to be attuned to the context in which the phenomenon occurs. And there are many different reasons to do qualitative research. And commonly we do it to challenge assumptions and then also to build knowledge. And there is one emphasis in qualitative research, especially as it applies to public policy. And that is problem definition. So I took the example of this conference. The title of this conference is 좋은 정보, 바람직한 정책. 근데 좋은 정보가 무엇일까요? 그리고 바람직한 정책이란 무엇일까요? 실적 연구자는 그런 질문 많이 해야 합니다. Because when we say 좋은 정보 or a good government, we assume that there is such a thing as a good government. 근데 실적 연구자가 좋은 정보라는 게 없다, 비판적으로 태어나는 건 아닙니다. 다만 좋은 정보 무엇일까? 제가 생각하는 좋은 정보랑 이 다른 분들 생각하는 좋은 정보가 무엇일까? 차이가 날까요? 그런 질문 많이 하죠. And the same for desirable policy. So if you say that a desirable policy is one that is effective, that is financially effective, then you make an explicit assumption and you also insert value into that policy. But what if you say that a desirable policy is one that is inclusive, one that considers all possible subjects to that policy, all possible recipients, all those who might be affected? That's a different way of defining desirable policy. 근데 실적 연구자로서 뭐가 바람직한지 말하는 건 아닙니다. 근데 우리가 이해하는 바람직한 정책 무엇인지 궁금합니다. So these days I do some documentary research. I look at public documents, so policy documents, and I trace these documents over time. And I look at how the definition of XYZ policy changes over time. And it changes depending on the perspective of those in position to develop policies. Let's say that there are ideological differences, or maybe there's a change over time. And so there is a lot of good research out there, qualitative research on public policies that show that these assumptions that underlies words such as 바람직한 정책, desirable policies, they can change, or they can be contextually embedded, meaning they might mean different things in one context than in another.
Hi, I'm Nora from Yonsei University. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? I totally get that we ask questions like, when we do qualitative research, what do we mean by good? That is a very good, typical, qualitative, really oriented research question. But I was wondering, what do you mean by we? What do we mean by good, right? But how do you define the range of we in qualitative research?
So that's a really good question. Actually, oftentimes the question of who are we is part of a research project in qualitative methodology. But what I meant by we in this context is, what do we, as members of KAPS, what do we mean by good policy? Because this document belongs to the KAPS. And so it belongs to our community. So assumingly, our community has an idea of what is good. And so let's say that, so what I study these days is the Ministry of Justice. Let's say that the Ministry of Justice releases a document. And that document says something about desirable labor. desirable talent. And then my question is, what does the Ministry of Justice mean by desirable talent? And so typically the we is whoever expresses an assumption such as desirable. So, does that answer the question?
You're saying that we define the we based on the context, based on circumstances, and based on our consensus for each of the cases that we are about to analyze using qualitative research methodology. So it changes, it varies over time and across countries. So it matches with the assumption, if I understood correctly, that you mentioned earlier in the presentation. You said it's not a binary relationship between quantitative and qualitative research methodology, but it's more of a qualitative-like. I mean, like there's no a priori knowledge, so we should decide which is more appropriate for each case when we do qualitative research. Is that, am I getting right, or?
So typically when we ask the question of what do we mean by a desirable policy, we are not looking to find the ultimate desirable or the ultimate good. We don't believe there exists such a thing. 이게 바람직한이라는 것이 없다. 그리고 좋은 정보라는 것이 없다. 근데 우리가 말하는 좋은 정보, 어떤 정보인지 그게 이해하고 싶은 것이죠. 그래서 so for example with the 법무부 documents that I look at, I'm not interested in the definition of desirable talent. It changes over time. And I assume it will change over time. That's okay. And there are not good or bad definitions of desirable talent. 근데 제 연구도 마찬가지고 대부분 실적 연구는 이러한 바람직한 정책 또는 뭐 바람직한 인력, 우리가 원하는 인력, 그거 알고 싶어 하는 이유가 그러한 assumption에 따라 정책이 달라진다. 그래서 예를 들어서 바람직한 인재, 뭐 고급 인력 무엇일까? 옛날에는 고급 인력 교육 수준이 높은 사람. 근데 현재는 고급 인력이라는 것은 고급 수준 교육뿐만 아니라 기술 창업할 줄 아는 사람. 그러니까 그거에 따라서 정책이 많이 달라지고 그거에 따라서 여기 한국으로 이민 오는 과정이 많이 달라집니다. 그리고 또 올 수 있는 이민자가 많이 달라집니다. 그래서 이 원하는 인재에 대한 뭐 definition, depending on the definition and how it changes over time, we can start to understand why we are seeing different patterns of migration, for example, since I do migration policy. And so the end goal is never to find out what is a good policy or what is the best definition, but the end goal is to understand what are the implications of that definition for a social phenomena. And so, for example, migration is a social phenomena. And so we want to understand how definitions of migrants and definitions of migrant categories, how they impact the process of migration over time. Okay. Another question is, why do qualitative research? And I think looking forward, qualitative research has an increasingly important position and role to play in a society, both here in Korea and elsewhere, that is increasingly polarized. And what is the link between polarization and qualitative methodology? qualitative methodology emphasizes that there is no one worldview. We understand the world differently, depending on our individual position, depending on the context that we're in, depending on the social group that we belong to. And so qualitative research directly tackles the issue of polarization, which is diverging worldviews. Qualitative research cannot solve that, and that's not the aim, but qualitative research can help us understand what are those different worldviews. And depending on what those worldviews are, we can start to understand why different political groups, social groups, why they want different types of policies. Because oftentimes when you have different worldviews, it's not merely a subject of opinion or an issue of opinion. You have typically different assumptions underlying those worldviews. I assume X, Y, Z, therefore, I believe that we should have policy A. But my friend assumes LMNOP, and therefore they assume that we should have policy B. So it's not simply about disagreeing on what type of end outcome we should have, but it's a different understanding of why we should have that outcome. And qualitative research head-on challenges the assumption that there is a common ground, that we have a common understanding, a common knowledge of how the world looks and how the world operates. And for example, what is the best policy? And in addition to polarization, we're also seeing the rise of a post-truth era. And what is happening is that people not only are not talking to each other, they're also not understanding each other. And so there is misunderstanding and attacks on different sides of, let's say, ideological spectrums or otherwise polarized societies. And so there is an erosion in trust. There's a difficulty in conversing. And so we need qualitative research to really observe on the ground, what are the different assumptions? What are the misconceptions that people held about each other? But let's extend beyond the time that we're in. Unfortunately, we are in the time of polarization. But even before this time and day, qualitative research had long held immense relevance to public policy. And there is especially one reason for that, and that is every public policy starts with a problem definition. So public policies are typically a solution to a public problem. If you assume that a policy is a solution to a problem, then you must first define that problem. And qualitative research in public policy, very much of it is concerned with disentangling how we understand the problem. And to argue that if a policy is not effective, maybe the issue is the definition of the problem, the underlying assumptions that we use to build that policy. But not only that, if we look further on in the policy cycle, there's also the stage of policy implementation. I might have a very good understanding of a policy or a public problem, and then it might yet still be implemented differently on the ground level. So let's say that I want to give poor people help. I'm a policymaker and I want poor people to be eligible for more public assistance. And so I create this policy program that if you're hardworking, if you're actively looking for jobs, then you're eligible for public assistance. And then we come to the policy implementation stage, where you have a public office at the local level, and that person who is a public officer, they have merely received this guideline, a hardworking person, someone who's looking for a job. What does that mean? Someone who is looking for a job applying every day? Someone who is applying once a month? Someone who is successfully applying for jobs? Or someone who is wanting a job but don't know how to apply? And a lot of qualitative research in public policy is concerned with these differences between problem definition and policy implementation and actual practice, and highlighting that our understanding depends on our context, but it also depends on how we define problems. And so there are multiple purposes of doing qualitative research in public policy. And it starts with the process, starting from problem definition, going on to implementation, and so forth. But in addition to that, it also emphasizes voice and power. Who get to decide the problem definition? Who is implementing that policy? How are they trained? What biases do they have? And so forth. And so when we engage with public policies in our research in this way, we start to uncover differences and structural differences, and we start to understand why there are inequalities. We start to understand why a person who is actively searching for jobs and on paper would qualify for public assistance is still not receiving it. Because there's a bias that if you don't apply every week, then you're not actively applying. You have to apply every day. And so one of the things that we see a lot in policy implementation research is a questioning of the position, not just of the researcher vis-a-vis the research subject, but of the research subject vis-a-vis public sector, vis-a-vis public policymakers, vis-a-vis public sector employees, and so forth. And this is not to say that it is always relational, that is focused on the individual level. To the contrary, qualitative research is oftentimes focused on the system that people belong to, the system that induce certain behavior. And to understand how institutions are built up in ways that encourage different types of behavior. And as an extension of that, how those behaviors impact typically vulnerable communities. So let's move to the next stage and talk about how to do qualitative research. So for those of you who have not done qualitative research before, I strongly encourage you to look into some key intellectual roots of this methodology. And for public policy and the social sciences, I particularly recommend social constructivism, cultural perspectives. These are about understanding that assumption definitions are socially construed. They are man-made. There is someone who is creating the definition of a problem. And cultural perspective is not only about Korean culture or British culture, it's also about a group culture, an institutional culture. So for example, in 행정학과 연구, there is a lot of good research on how organization develop a culture, an organizational culture. And that is oftentimes not deliberate or intentional, but it evolves over time. And typically what we point out in qualitative research is that there are certain institutional features that encourage this type of culture. Regardless of what stage you are in your qualitative research, when you actually do this qualitative study, it's immensely important that you draw on some type of theory. And there are policy theories that are specific to our field, but at the same time, there are also social and cultural theories that extend beyond the field of public policy, that are oftentimes drawn from sociology and other fields, and that are widely applied in social policy studies that draw on qualitative research. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm afraid I might be interrupting you too much, but you talked mostly about the common ground between qualitative and quantitative research methodology, especially in the earlier presentations. And you also said how it is hard to draw a strict line between the two, right? In that sense, when you say do qualitative research, I was wondering what you would be exactly, what does that exactly mean? Do you do qualitative research fully in a study or partly, or how partly? Like how you balance between the qualitative and quantitative research? Because if there is no strict line, if their relationship is not binary, then you should, in most studies, you should combine these two. You should balance these two, right? So when you say do qualitative research, I know you should decide that based on the circumstances, based on the cases, but usually, what do you mean by do qualitative research, if that makes any sense?
So usually when we say that we do qualitative research, I had a slide where when we do qualitative research, we feature one of three elements, and those are the type of qualitative data or qualitative analysis. And I will get to that. So what is qualitative data and what is qualitative analysis? But to do a qualitative research project means to include either qualitative data or qualitative analysis. And I would say beyond traditional definitions, I would say that qualitative data, the type of data that you use, is incredibly important to the reviewers of your research. So if they want to see a qualitative project, typically they want to see some type of qualitative data involved. Okay, so to get back to how to do qualitative research, before we move on to the data and the analysis, there are two types of research questions that we can adopt before we start collecting our data. And the first one is wanting to understand the social group. So do you recall that I talked about anthropology and the humanities? So in this type of field, it is both expected and rewarded when you go into a community and you immerse yourself in that community. So in our case, that would be, for example, a police department or a police office. What are the dynamics in that office, in that department? And to understand the organizational culture. We also see this in 행정학과 연구. But in policy research, typically the type of research that is rewarded by reviewers and editors is research that focus on phenomenon. And so your research question want to focus not on who or what, but on why and when. And so you want to understand under which conditions do, let's say, policy recipients, under what conditions do they break the conditions of their policy assistance? And social cohesion, as I study, so 사회 통합. 예를 들어서 교육, 다문화 교육 받으면은 그러면 다문화 수용성이 높아지는지, 그러면 사회 통합, 교육이 사회 통합이 높이는지 그런 거 이해하고 싶은 목적으로 연구하면은 그러면 정책 분야 실적 연구할 수 있는 거죠. 많이 하는 거죠. So when you start your research project, you really want to consider whether you are publishing in an SSCI journal or an HCI journal. Because the expectations towards your research question and also to the subject that you're studying, whether you're studying a social group or a social phenomena, it will depend on the type of journal that you submit to. Both is good research. it's not to say that one is better than the other, but it really depends on the field that you're publishing in, because the fields have different preferences. Okay, finally, how to do qualitative research. Maybe I should have put it earlier, so sorry for keeping you waiting. So there are at least 4 or 5 different ways of doing qualitative data collection. And the most commonly known is perhaps ethnography. So ethnography is also known as participant observation. So I go to a classroom, I observe the interaction between a teacher and the students. Or I go into a community and I observe the interaction between community members. Or I go to a public office and I look at the application interactions between a public employee and a citizen recipient. And so what I do in this type of research is I go into a field site, I observe. And so what is the data resulting from that? The data resulting from that is a set of analytic memos. In other words, in simple words, I write down what I see. I write down what I observe, meaning what happens, and then I write down how I understand what happens. 어떻게 행동하는지, 왜 이렇게 행동하는지, 그렇게 행동하면 어떤 반응이 들어오는지, 그런 여러 가지 observation 같이 작성해서 analytical memo 만드는 겁니다. And it's incredibly important that you keep all the analytical memos and that you store those as data, just as you would in any other type of data. And ethnography in this day and age, it also extends to what we call virtual ethnography. So I can go onto Twitter, I can go onto Reddit, I can go onto Instagram, and I can observe what people are saying, what type of pictures they're uploading, how they interact with each other. But virtual ethnography is a bit tricky because it has more blurry ethical boundaries. Typically, when I go into a community physically, I ask that community for permission. Hey, can I sit in this classroom and observe you? Is that okay with you? And they will say yes or no. But if I go onto someone else's Instagram, I collect data from their Instagram and I write about it in the research. If I haven't received their permission, the ethical boundaries are blurry. And so this is a big challenge in this day and age of qualitative research. And then we have the second big type of data collection, which is interviews. So interviews can be done in person, it can be done online, through Zoom, through Teams. And interviews, typically the resulting data from an interview is a transcript, meaning a written record of the conversation that happened. And when you do an interview or when you do ethnography, remember positionality, who you are and what kind of questions you ask, the tone that you use is going to reflect on the answers and the behavior of those you observe. We also have different types of interviews. So traditionally, it's been popular to write down a set of questions and ask those to the research subject. But also increasingly, there are some other popular methods, such as tell me the story of you becoming a graduate student. How did you arrive at graduate school? What was the process leading up to that? And so the interviewer prompts the research subject to convey their experiences through a storytelling format. Another type of interview research is when we do focus group. And then you might ask, should I do a focus group or should I do an individual interview? It depends on your aim. If you are interested in individual perspectives, individual experiences, then do an individual interview. But if you're interested in dynamics, social dynamics, for example, how our opinion changes through our conversation, that's when you do a focus group interview. And so what type of data collection you do, it will very much depend on what data you're looking for. What is your research question? Is your research question asking about participant attitudes, participant behavior? Those two are very different things. And also in qualitative research, there is something called participatory action research. Participatory action research is when the researcher does not treat the research subject merely as a research subject, but when they're doing the research together. 그 사회복지학과에서 일하는 colleague 이런 participatory action research 하셨는데요. 되게 재미있더라고요. 근데 저는 개인적으로 좀 힘들 것 같은데 시간도 많이 걸리고 어렵고 근데 그만큼 제가 생각하는 질문이나 제가 궁금해하는 데이터뿐만 아니라 그들 강조하는 입장, 그들 강조하는 문제나 해결 방법 그것도 데이터에서 나타나니까 participatory action research 많이 하는 겁니다. So the point of participatory action research is that it's not a one-way interaction. It's not me asking questions. It is the participant, the research participant, they're asking themselves questions. They are suggesting the topic that they want to study. They are suggesting the type of questions that they want to discuss. And so they are shaping, by they I mean the research subject, they are part of shaping the research study. And finally, unobtrusively collect data. So this includes archival data and also historiography. And they're slightly different, but also share some similarities. So basically, we're looking at documents or any type of material evidence. It could be photos, it could be written text. We also, in this day and age, we have digital media. It could be YouTube videos, it could be SNS. And so you have various formats, various types of data. But the point is that it's some type of material that you can collect without interacting with a research subject. And then you can analyze that material. Unobtrusively collecting data is useful because it allows us to look at statements in their original form. I'm not asking or challenging or interfering with the research subject in any way. So for example, with the 법무부 연구 that I'm doing, if I want to understand how they justify their research, then I should interview them. But if I want to understand the underlying assumptions of their policy, then I will look at their policy documents. And so really the type of response or the type of data that you're looking for will determine what type of data collection you engage in. And oftentimes in qualitative research, we do something called triangulation. Triangulation means that we consider it not sufficient to only look at one source. So for example, you can combine interviews with ethnography, which is very popular. So I both observe what my research participants do, but then I also get to talk to them and understand why they do it. But there are some trade-offs. It's great combining different resources. It's great to have many research subjects or to spend a lot of time with them. But in reality, oftentimes we need to make decisions about how many research subjects we can possibly take on. And interestingly, in qualitative research, more is not always better. So there are two ways of knowing whether we have sufficient data. The first one is called saturation. That is when you have a set of data and you add on new data, and at some point, you realize that there's no new data coming out of this. There's no new observation. I have sufficiently collected information about this research subject. And then the other one is heterogeneity. So this is a new approach in the research methodology. And this approach emphasizes not sufficiency, but the variety of perspectives. So if I collect, let's say I collect interviews. I do 5 interviews, and then I do 10 interviews. And I start seeing that there are some repeating perceptions or repeating experiences, but there is also some variety. They're not all saying the same. They have different, slightly different perceptions about those experiences. Then I have variation in my data. And so I can assume that the data is more representative. And when you do research, keep thinking about this question during data collection. Okay, thank you. So let's say that you have collected all of your data and you want to analyze it. The first thing you can do is ground a theory. That's what I talked about at the very beginning of the lecture, is when we have data collected from the ground and we make a brand new theory. This is difficult, and it is more typical of the humanities or for perhaps senior scholars with a lot of time to spare, because you need really extensive data collection in order to be able to build a whole new theory. And also typically you need to be trained in theoretical thinking, because after all, you're constructing theory, which is arguably a very difficult thing to do. So what is the more common approach to data? You have collected your data, you can quantify it, so that is content analysis. How often does this word occur? And you can treat the text as a data set, not only quantifying a small amount of data, but actually collecting large sets of, let's say, YouTube comments, or let's say that I'm collecting 10 policy documents. And I want to understand what words are occurring together. So that is what we call topic modeling. Or what is the tone of these policy documents? Are they negative, positive? And so that is when we use text as data or approach text as data. And that text can be interview text, it can be analytical memos, it can be archived material. So it can be any type of data. This is an analytical approach. And then also perhaps more common is thematic analysis and discourse analysis. So with thematic analysis, we are focused on finding themes in our observations. And that is not to say we are looking for simple categories. For example, positive statement, negative statement. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for analytical categories. So for example, justifying a behavior. We want to understand the social process in some way by analyzing our data thematically. And then we use these thematic codes and we develop a set of assumptions. And then with discourse analysis, we assume that words contain assumption and word contains values. And so we engage in discourse analysis of public documents, of interview transcripts, and so forth, in order to disentangle these underpinning values that come true to the discourse. And by discourse, we mean talk or language, sentence constructions. But what about public policy research? Assumingly, you want to do a qualitative research project in public policy or about public policy, and there are some analytical frameworks that are developed specifically in response to the qualitative study of public policy. And there are three that I favor, so I included these. There might be more, but these are three pretty common popular approaches that have existed for a while. So they're tested and tried over time. The first one is interpretive policy analysis. And this approach very much questions the meaning making. So starting from problem definition to policy implementation, what is the meaning making of those who impose the policy, but also what is the meaning making of those who are at the receiving end of a policy? And so this approach emphasizes different meaning-making processes depending on the individual that you observe. And Jana uses that to highlight the different understanding of a single problem, and also to then explain possible gaps between practice and intended policy. Bucky is more aligned with discourse analysis, which is very much focused on the linguistic aspects of public policy. So the language that we use and how those words that we use both signal different values or attitudes, but also how they communicate certain assumptions. And Bucky is also quite focused on categorical assumptions. So let's say students, what do we mean by students? And what we mean by students, how does that impact the scope of that policy? And then finally, we have institutional analysis. What I wanted to highlight here is that what type of analytical framework you adopt, it should correspond with the theoretical framework that you adopt. So the narrative policy framework is a theoretical framework, and the interpretive policy analysis is an analytical framework. And so I encourage you to think carefully about the correspondence between the theoretical framework that you adopt and how that aligns with your analytical framework, and also whether your data supports those set of framework. So I'll do this one quick. What we really want to do for a qualitative research project is to make sure that from the data collection stage process to our analysis and theory building stages, that we have an integrated approach. And finally, a few tips for doing qualitative research. I've done mixed methods, and it's a lot of fun. It's very rewarding. It's very enriching. You get to connect with the data in a different way because you're approaching it from different epistemologies. But at the same time, it can be difficult to publish because qualitative researchers prepare traditional qualitative research, and quantitative research prepare traditional quantitative research. And so although I argue that there's a continuum, just like other mixed method scholars argue there's a continuum, in reality, there still exists the binary. And so oftentimes, that is not just an issue of opinion. It's not that I don't like the other type of research. It might be that I cannot find a reviewer. I'm an editor of a qualitative journal. I received your mixed method study, but I cannot find a reviewer for it. And so you have these practical issues too that we need to think about as researchers, especially if you're an early scholar researcher, a graduate student. Think about whether your study is feasibly publishable. Think about whether you can afford to go through multiple stages of rejection. And so, as much as mixed methods research is rewarding, think carefully about whether you want to try that at this stage and time. And finally, when you write your research report, be attuned to the writing style of the journals that you submit to. In a quantitative project, typically we start with introduction, followed by theory, research design. We do the analysis part first, and then we do the findings, discussing the analysis. That is different from interpretive writing, which is more common in qualitative research. So in interpretive writing, we combine the analysis and the findings part. So we discuss our analysis while we present it. So it's a different way of writing. And also in qualitative research in social sciences, we oftentimes see what we call confessional writing. So that is reflecting on your positionality and your being reflexive. And finally, the last comment that I have is be careful about the case approach in qualitative research. So you do go into a community and that is your case. And then you talk about with people in that community who are your units. But be careful that your study is not about your case. Your case is your data. The point of your study is to generalize some knowledge derived from that case, from the observation of that case. And so when you write your research, you really want to emphasize the more generalizable points. Okay, let's skip. And finally, this is perhaps one of the most important things to do as a qualitative researcher writing the analysis and findings part is to demonstrate with quotes, with transcript evidence, with documentary evidence, whatever claim you make about your data. You went into the field, so let's say, I went into this community, I observed XYZ. Then show that you observed it. Specifically, what did you observe? My research participants said that A, B, C. Okay, what did they say? Insert a quote. Insert 2 quotes. Show that they said it. And then also then, after you have done that, talk about how those quotes and how those statements, behaviors, how do they present evidence for your generalizable claim. So be attuned both to your data presentation and how it aligns with your theoretical contribution. I'll do this one with a smile. IRBs are hard and they take time. I applied for an IRB in March and I told my co-author, we don't start this project until August because I don't know how long the IRB is going to take. The one finished, the other one is still in progress. So hopefully we're starting next month. But doing an IRB is rewarding because it teaches you ethics and it makes you think about and makes you write up the basic structure of your research. So it's good. I really recommend IRB. Also because you need it if you want to publish it in an SSCI journal. They require IRB in most cases. But it takes time. So apply for an IRB, let's say in March, and then do other projects until you're ready in August. And so think of qualitative research as a game in the long run. If you're looking to publish in a Scopus journal or perhaps even in a KCI journal, you might not need an IRB. But if you aim for SSCI or that is the criteria of your graduation, then start early. Do this first and then everything else comes after. Thank you.
세션 마무리하겠습니다. 감사합니다.